Welcome. You are about to step onto the dirt roads of 19th century America, a land of impossible dreams and devastating choices. In a land promised by manifest destiny, one man had to choose between the chains of debt in the East and the lawless, deadly freedom bought by gold in the West. This is the story of Elias Thorne, a Virginia farmer who traded the scent of fertile earth for the whispers of gold, following a rumor that would shatter a continent. From the grueling passage of the Rubicon Trail to the brutal crucible of iron and dust in California, Elias found that wealth was fragile and true freedom was paid for in blood. Witness the unraveling, where he takes on the weight of the badge, a lonely stand against political titans and ruthless claim jumpers, leading to a climax where everything he built turns to ashes. This is The Last Horizon. If you like these stories, please like and subscribe. And if you want, tell us in the comments which myth you are most excited for, or where in the world are you listening from, and what time it is for you. Thank you for being here. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let us begin. The sky over the Shenandoah Valley in the autumn of 1845 was a riot of spent color. Oaks shedding hues of rust and dried blood, their branches skeletal against the high, pale sun. For Elias Thorne, the land had always been his anchor and his curse. He was 23, built like a draft horse, and possessed of a quiet, relentless ambition that felt far too large for the 200 acres of tobacco and corn his family had worked for 3 generations. His father, Old Man Thorne, had the grit of the soil caked under his fingernails, and the suspicion of a man perpetually waiting for the next drought or tax collector. "Land is the only honest master, Elias," he would often rasp, his voice raw from years of field dust. But honesty didn't pay the debts. The Thornes were plain folk, neither rich enough to ignore the market's volatility, nor poor enough to flee their burdens outright. They were trapped in the middle, watching their small, precious holdings shrink bit by agonizing bit, consumed by the rising demands of an expanding, complex nation. Elias walked the southern boundary line, his boots crunching on the dry stalks. The land was fertile, yes, but fallow in opportunity. Everything worth owning had already been claimed, worked, or bought up by the wealthy planters who lived in the grand houses nearer the river. Their prosperity was built on cash crops and a system Elias tried not to think about too closely, a system of human chattel that allowed them to reap fortunes, while Elias and his father broke their backs for meager returns. His mother, a woman who rarely smiled, but whose silence spoke volumes, worried herself thin over the winter's looming chill and the empty purse. The state of the world beyond the valley was a constant low-level fever. Texas had just been annexed, stoking the flames of sectional division and the looming specter of war with Mexico. The air was thick with political rhetoric, talk of manifest destiny, of God's given right to claim the continent from ocean to ocean. It was a grand idea, but to Elias, destiny sounded suspiciously like a wealthy man's excuse to steal more ground. Yet buried within that noise was a persistent, thrilling counter-narrative, the promise of new land. He reached the old oak tree where his younger sister Abigail was waiting. Abigail was different. She read books instead of people, and her gaze was always fixed westward on maps printed in cheap newspapers. She didn't want the land. She wanted a life free of the crushing weight of their father's debt and despair. "Did you find anything?" Elias asked, knowing the answer. Abigail held out a damp, folded sheet of newsprint, the ink smudged from her nervous grip. It wasn't the usual gossip of the Virginia Assembly. It was a circular, printed crude and bold, from a promoter in St. Louis. "Go west, young man, and stake your claim."
The Oregon Territory. Land awaits, rich earth, no debt, true freedom. "It's not just Oregon anymore, Elias," she whispered, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. "Listen to this part. This came yesterday, tacked up at the general store." She traced a line on the paper. "They say a man named Sutter out in California found something more valuable than good soil." She read the words, and they felt like a spark dropping onto dry tinder. Unprecedented deposits of yellow metal, enough to make every honest man a king. Elias's skepticism was a heavy cloak he wore every day, but the mention of yellow metal pierced the gloom like a stray sunbeam. Gold, it was a word associated with kings and curses, but also with escape. "Nonsense, Abby. It's a trick to sell shoddy wagons," he muttered, trying to sound convinced. "Or it's the truth," she challenged, her pale eyes blazing. "We have nothing left to lose but this endless struggle. Father will sell the North Field next spring to pay off the store ledger. If we stay, we starve slowly. If we go—" Her hand closed over his forearm, the grip surprisingly strong. "If we go, we might lose everything quickly, but we might also win back the future." The moment hung suspended. Below them, the familiar, beloved, yet exhausting fields of the Thorne farm. It was a life of certainty, but a certainty of poverty. Beyond the mountains, beyond the known world, lay the great unknown, a terrifying abyss of wilderness, savage heat, and cholera. But it also held the promise of an immediate, violent break from the chains of debt. Elias looked from the worn paper to his sister's desperate, hopeful face. He thought of his father's stoicism, his mother's quiet fear, and the acres of soil that had broken their backs. The truth was, the ground here was fallow for them. It would never yield the life they needed. He took the circular from her hand, folding it carefully, placing the weight of the decision into his own pocket. The sun had dipped lower, casting long, dramatic shadows. "California," Elias said, the word tasting alien and sharp on his tongue. He had just received his call to action, and it wasn't a noble desire for expansion or destiny. It was a simple, desperate, terrifying need. The fallow ground had forced him onto the open road. The days following the newsprint discovery were steeped in a tense, pervasive silence at the Thorne farm. Elias kept the circular tucked inside his Bible, the thin paper more sacred to him now than the scriptures. The silence broke 3 evenings later, after the supper of thin corn stew, when Elias placed the crumpled leaflet squarely in the middle of the pine table. Old Man Thorne, who had been carving a whistle for a neighbor's boy, stopped mid-stroke. His eyes, the same faded blue as a washed-out denim shirt, narrowed as they took in the headline, "Gold in California." "A fool's errand," the elder Thorne declared, not even bothering to pick up the paper. "A land of snakes and heathens, and a trip that'll kill a man quicker than consumption. They print lies, boy, to fill their own pockets." "They print hope, Father," Elias countered, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We harvested 90 barrels this season, 90 barrels, and we still owe the bank enough that Mr. Hemlock will take the North Field by spring. That's a certainty. What's in this paper is a risk, but it's a chance for a new certainty, to start clean, without a mortgage on our souls." His mother, normally withdrawn, looked up from her mending. "Elias, those wagon trails are littered with bones, women and children. It is not a trip for a family." "Not for the whole family," Elias confirmed, looking directly at his father. "It's for me and Abby. We can't take the land, but we can take the wagon, a yoke of oxen, and our own 2 hands. We go, we work, and we send back enough to pay off Hemlock and put a fence around this place so tight no one can ever touch it again." His proposal, bald and audacious, hung heavy in the low-ceilinged cabin. It was a rejection of everything Old Man Thorne stood for: stability, loyalty to the soil, and the inherited stoic suffering of their Virginian life. "You abandon your legacy," his father said, the anger cold and precise. "You turn your back on your kin for a fairy tale." "No, father, I'm choosing a different legacy," Elias insisted, suddenly feeling the weight of his 23 years morph into the resolve of a patriarch. "The legacy of freedom. If I stay here, I become a hired hand on my own land. If I go, I become the master of my own fate." Abigail, sitting silently beside him, pushed a small, battered, leather-bound copy of Emerson forward. "It is not lies, father. People are leaving from Independence, Missouri right now. Thousands. The path is open. The Oregon Trail is already a road. This California rumor is simply the catalyst we needed." The sheer logistics were a monumental hurdle. They needed flour, dried meat, coffee, a rifle that wouldn't jam, and tools, and they had no cash. The decision, Elias realized, was not just about going, but about the painful, irreversible act of divestment. The whispers of gold soon transformed into the clamor of sacrifice. Over the next 2 weeks, Elias and his father, in grim, strained partnership, began the dismantling of the Thorne life. They sold the small, beloved horse, Betsy, to a neighbor who drove a hard bargain. They traded the unused iron plowshares for bags of dried beans and salt pork. Elias's mother wept silently as she packed a small bag of medicinal herbs and gave Elias her only silver locket, a useless piece of sentimentality that was nonetheless priceless.
The final wrenching act came when Elias drove their remaining 2 oxen and the wagon into the nearest town of Staunton. He was not selling, he was trading. With his meager funds and the iron-willed leverage of a desperate man, he acquired an older, sturdier covered wagon with double canvas, the kind built to withstand river crossings. He also managed to trade some corn surplus for a decent, if used, Hawken rifle and 50 rounds of powder and shot. He felt like a thief, but he knew he was just trading one form of poverty for another, temporarily. The final parting was agonizing. Old Man Thorne, stiff and unforgiving, refused to look at the customized leather harness Elias had made him years ago, now destined to pull the family's future across the continent. "You go," his father finally said, his voice flat as the winter ground. "But don't come back empty-handed, not for my sake, but for your mother's. And if that gold isn't there, you stay west and find something that is. Don't waste the land you left behind." It was not a blessing, but a grim mandate. On the morning of their departure, November 18th, a chill fog clung to the valley floor. Elias, driving the oxen, and Abigail, perched beside him, looked back at the small, sturdy log cabin. Elias took a deep breath, inhaling the familiar scent of pine smoke and damp earth, a smell he knew he might never encounter again. Abigail clutched a small, carefully wrapped tin containing seeds, not of tobacco or corn, but of wildflowers and hardy European wheat, seeds of the life she hoped to plant in their new land. As the wagon rumbled onto the main road, heading north toward the Cumberland Gap and then west toward the Mississippi, the sound of the wagon wheels became the rhythmic beat of their new existence. They were heading into a region being consumed by political upheaval, a country tearing itself apart over the question of expansion and slavery, but all Elias could hear was the simple, alluring whisper of gold, pulling him toward the unknown, demanding a sacrifice that could either save his family or erase them from history. The decision was made. The crossing had begun. They were no longer Virginians bound by their soil. They were emigrants, American pioneers, charting a course toward an uncertain destiny. The Rubicon was not a single river, but 1,000 miles of grit, swollen creeks, and aching loneliness. For Elias and Abigail, it began not in the west, but in the miserable slosh of early winter mud near the Ohio River.
They had reached Independence, Missouri in late March 1846, too late to catch the main rush of wagons, but just early enough to avoid the worst summer heat. The town was a feverish staging ground, a chaotic blend of rough entrepreneurs, religious zealots, and desperate families, all unified by the westward fever.
Elias quickly learned that the journey was less about pioneering spirit and more about relentless, back-breaking management. Their first challenge was economic. The prices for provisions in Independence were predatory. 100 weight of sugar cost twice what it had in Staunton. He had to trade his mother's beautiful, serviceable copper kettle for an extra 10 pounds of poor-quality flour, a decision that stung with shame. Their true Rubicon moment arrived when they left the last semblance of established society behind. Just west of Independence, the familiar roads dissolved into muddy tracks rutted by thousands of previous wagon wheels. The landscape flattened, and the vast, terrifying indifference of the American prairie began to assert itself. The immediate difficult challenge was the ox team. Despite their strength, the oxen, named Patience and Grit, were worn down by the poor feed and endless pushing. Elias, who had always understood the rhythms of a farm, now faced the brutal demands of a trail he did not know. One cold, rainy morning near the Big Blue River, they encountered their first major setback. The wagon, heavy with supplies, became mired deep in a slick clay bank. Elias fought the mud for 2 hours, straining his back and yelling until his throat was raw, but the oxen could only manage a frightened, exhausted lowing. A larger, more professional outfit, a family named Sterling heading to Oregon, passed them by. The patriarch, a stout, cold-eyed man named Jedediah, simply spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground nearby. "Greenhorns," Jedediah scoffed, not slowing his pace. "If you can't get out of the mud, boy, you'll never see the Rockies. Don't waste your strength." It was a sharp societal lesson. On the trail, compassion was a luxury no one could afford. Survival demanded isolation and self-reliance. Elias felt a profound wave of despair. He was alone, mocked and immobilized. Abigail, however, proved to be his unexpected strength. While Elias rested his aching muscles, she approached the stuck wheel not with brute force, but with observation. "The right rear is resting on that rock, Elias. If we clear that stone, the pressure might shift," she suggested quietly. They spent the next hour using a small spade and a length of rope as a lever. It was slow, tedious work, but by sundown they managed to free the wheel. Elias learned a vital lesson. This journey required intellect and tenacity more than sheer muscle. He had crossed his first physical barrier, but the moral challenge of the trail was just beginning. As the weeks passed and they moved along the Platte River, the sense of community on the trail became an essential yet fragile commodity. They joined a small company of 6 wagons, seeking safety in numbers from bandits and the increasingly nervous encounters with local Native American tribes whose land they were crossing. One night, gathered around a small, smoky fire, the talk turned to the destination. A quiet, elderly man named Mr. Finch, heading to Oregon, leaned across the flames. "California, that's a risky choice, young man," Finch said, his eyes troubled. "The truth is, Elias, most folk on this trail think that gold is a curse. It draws the worst kind of people, outlaws, claim jumpers. Here we face the wilderness. Out there, you'll face the devil in man." Elias realized that his ideology, the belief that gold represented freedom and a quick escape from debt, was an outlier. For most, the West meant farming and stability. His pursuit of fortune was viewed with suspicion and a deep, ingrained American prejudice against quick wealth. It was a new kind of isolation.
The toughest moral dilemma came a week later. They had been struck by a terrible intestinal illness, likely from tainted water. Several members of their small company were sick, including a young woman named Sarah. Her husband was desperate. He offered Elias their last remaining item of true value, a silver-plated pistol. in exchange for a small portion of Elias's carefully rationed medical supply of laudanum. Elias knew the pistol would be invaluable protection, and his supplies were already dangerously low. The thought of losing Abby to illness because he had been too charitable was paralyzing. Yet, looking at the man's ravaged face, Elias heard his mother's voice echoing, "We help those who are struggling, Elias, even when we have little." Crossing the Rubicon meant sacrificing immediate personal gain for a larger, more humane purpose. He handed over a small vial of laudanum, refusing the pistol. "Keep the weapon," Elias said gruffly. "You'll need it more than I need your silver, but use this wisely." As they pulled away the next morning, leaving the sick behind, Elias felt both lighter and heavier. He hadn't gained a protective firearm, but he had solidified the code that would guide his survival. He had crossed the boundary from the self-interested logic of his debt-ridden past into the harsh, demanding moral economy of the trail. The final geographical boundary of this stage came with the sight of the jagged, impossible peaks of the Rocky Mountains, the insurmountable wall separating the East from the Promised Land. Looking up at the cold, silent stone, Elias knew that the decisions were made, the ties were cut, and his transformation was complete. They had passed the point of no return. They arrived in California in the late fall of 1847, nearly a year before the gold rush exploded into global frenzy. The Thornes did not find a land of milk and honey. They found a raw, unsettled territory gripped by a tense transition. The United States had effectively annexed the land from Mexico, yet authority was fragmented, and the population was a volatile mixture of Mexican families, hardened trappers, and a few ambitious American settlers clustering near the coast. Elias and Abigail settled near Sutter's Fort, a crude, sprawling outpost that smelled perpetually of hides, sweat, and ambition. They were too early for the famous discovery at Coloma, which was months away, but their goal remained the same: to acquire land and resources before the inevitable rush. They used the last of their funds to purchase a small, rough-hewn parcel near a stretch of river north of the fort, hoping to stake a farming claim and begin their enterprise. This was the true crucible. The work was relentless. The land had to be cleared, not just of brush, but of the immense, stubborn prejudice of the few established settlers who viewed any new arrivals, especially those arriving with empty hands, as competition. The core conflict became clear immediately: iron versus dust. The dust, the physical challenge, was brutal. The earth was unforgiving, baked hard by the long, dry summers. Elias had to work with an intensity that dwarfed his efforts in Virginia. He spent weeks digging irrigation ditches, channeling water from the meager stream to his patch of ground. His hands were perpetually blistered, and the dust, fine and red, coated his lungs and his clothes, turning him into a ghost of his former self. Abigail, adapting to the harsh reality, took on the burden of managing their limited livestock and provisions. She bartered skillfully at the fort, a rare talent among the desperate miners and settlers. She traded small game Elias hunted for hardier seeds and critical supplies, facing down gruff storekeepers who assumed a woman alone would be easily cheated. The iron, however, was worse than the physical labor. Their nearest neighbor, a grizzled, intimidating man named Silas Croft, had been squatting on his massive, ill-defined claim for years. Croft considered the entire riverbend his property. Croft approached Elias's nascent homestead one afternoon, his rifle leaning casually against his shoulder. "This ain't Virginia, boy," Croft drawled, his voice slow and menacing. "We don't go by deeds and stamps here. We go by possession, and I possessed this riverbank before you were out of swaddling cloths. You're trespassing." Elias stood his ground, gripping the handle of his shovel. "I paid Sutter's agent for this parcel. I have papers." Croft merely laughed, a harsh barking sound.
papers are for preachers and bankers. Out here, land is owned by iron and blood." He kicked over a section of their newly dug ditch, watching the precious water spill into the dry earth. "Move on, or I'll move you." This was the harsh reality. Building a community enterprise meant challenging the existing lawless order. Elias realized that the true freedom advertised on the circulars meant the freedom to fight, and perhaps the freedom to die. The only justice was the one you could enforce yourself.
Elias did not fight Croft that day. He knew he would lose. Instead, he worked smarter. He spent days tracking the boundary markers and old surveyor lines. He discovered that Croft's actual legal claim, if one existed, was far smaller than the territory he terrorized. The true turning point came weeks later during the construction of their small cabin. While Elias was raising the ridge beam, Croft and two of his hired hands rode up, clearly intending violence. Abigail stepped out of the half-built structure, not with a firearm, but with a meticulously copied legal document, an old Mexican land survey map, translated and notarized by a traveling circuit judge she had tracked down at the fort. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and carrying, "the property you claim ends 87 yards north of this stream. This document is authenticated. If you take one step across that line, my brother will defend his property, and the circuit judge will make sure your claim is entirely revoked." She had not just faced resistance, she had faced harsh realities with preparation and wit. Croft, taken aback by the combination of legal literacy and raw courage from a young woman, hesitated. His strength was bullying and isolation. Abigail had brought law and community, the circuit judge, into the wilderness. Croft spat one last time, but defeated, turned his horse and rode away. They were still poor, still struggling, but they had won their ground, literally. And then the moment arrived. It was January 1848. Elias was not digging for gold, but for a post hole to reinforce a fence miles from their homestead. He noticed a peculiar glimmer in the damp clay near the stream bank. He dug it out. It was a flake, heavy and unmistakably metallic. The gold rush, the true catalyst that would shatter the tranquility of the territory, had begun, not with a massive strike, but with a single, quiet whisper of true gold in the hand of a man who was simply trying to fence his farm. Elias stood there, the dust covering his face, the iron resolve hardening his soul, and the tiny flake of yellow metal shining in his palm. The crucible had not broken him, it had forged him. He knew immediately that this meant not just wealth, but absolute, terrifying chaos. His struggle had just entered a new, far more dangerous phase. The year 1848 was not a year of months, but a blurred sequence of frenetic days. Elias's initial discovery of gold, quietly made while fencing his property, remained his secret for a precious brief few weeks. He and Abigail began working their small creek bed with a deliberate, desperate silence. They did not mind, they panned, scraping gravel from the stream and shaking the heavy, rewarding silt. The trickle of yellow metal became a steady stream. By spring, the large glass jar Elias had buried beneath the floorboards was half full of flakes, nuggets, and fine gold dust. They were not millionaires, but they were no longer bound by debt. They had achieved temporary victory. This victory instantly transformed their lives, but it also created an intense, fragile prosperity. They quickly used the gold not for luxury, but for stability. Elias secured the legal title to their land, paying a staggering sum to a newly arrived government agent, and invested in proper livestock and durable farming equipment. Abigail purchased a library of books and quality tools, including a sturdy European-made sewing machine, marking their transition from subsistence survival to true enterprise. Their tiny homestead, once a desperate scramble of logs and mud, became a model of efficiency, fenced, plowed, and provisioned.
They were the first in their small area to achieve this self-sufficiency, a beacon of new American industriousness carved out of the rough Californian landscape. But the success was built on a foundation of sand. The tension began to coil around them immediately. First, there was the external chaos. By summer, the whispers of gold had become a global roar. Ships clogged San Francisco Bay. Roads were choked with frantic fortune seekers from all corners of the globe: Boston merchants, Chinese laborers, Latin American families, and hardened veterans. The area near Sutter Fort morphed overnight into a raw, lawless boomtown. Elias's biggest concern was no longer the scarcity of food, but the scarcity of order. The formal government of California was non-existent, still wrestling between military rule and territorial status. In the mines, the only law was the code of the strongest or the quickest. The seeds of future conflict began to sprout from the very ground they had struggled to secure. The primary seed was the land dispute. Silas Croft, their bullying neighbor, reappeared, his eyes gleaming not with local arrogance, but with the madness of greed. He had been unsuccessful in the crowded, rich fields north of them, and had returned to try to seize the Thornes' now valuable water source. Croft brought not 2 hired hands, but 10 heavily armed men. "You got too big for your boots, Thorne," Croft snarled one afternoon, watching Elias work his newly installed water wheel. "That stream belongs to the man who can hold it." Elias stood behind his property line, holding his Hawken rifle, its barrel leveled. He relied not on his own strength, but on the certainty of his new legal deeds and the presence of his prosperity. "I bought this land with gold, Croft. Gold I mined with my own hands. I have papers and
witnesses. If you cross this line, you're not just jumping a claim. You're attacking a legally registered American citizen on his own property." The threat was clear. Elias had moved beyond the lawless crucible. He was now using the nascent tools of the state to enforce his claim. Croft, realizing that Elias was no longer a lone greenhorn, retreated, but the incident left a bitter residue. Croft was not defeated. He was merely waiting for a moment of vulnerability. The second conflict was political. As more Southerners poured into the territory, eager to exploit the mineral wealth, the air became thick with rhetoric about the peculiar institution, slavery. Many Southern planters saw California not just as a source of wealth, but as fertile ground to expand the system of human bondage westward. A wealthy, influential Missourian named Senator Preston arrived nearby, advocating fiercely for California to be admitted to the Union as a slave state. Elias, deeply rooted in the anti-slavery sentiments of his mother's Shenandoah family, found himself in direct opposition. He had come west for freedom from debt, not to perpetuate the chains on others. At a volatile community meeting in the hastily erected town square, Preston spoke of property rights and state sovereignty. Elias, encouraged by Abigail, stood up, a simple farmer against a political titan. "Senator Preston," Elias said, his voice ringing with hard-won authority, "the gold we are finding here is for the hands that dig it. This land is too hard, the work too grinding to be built on forced labor. We left our homes for freedom, not to build another kingdom on the backs of the oppressed. California must enter as a free state." His statement created an uproar. Some cheered him, mostly the northern and immigrant miners. Many others, especially those associated with the southern syndicates, hissed threats. The fragile prosperity had given Elias a voice, but that voice had instantly made him a political enemy in a territory teetering on the brink of civil war. Elias walked back to his prosperous farm that evening, the jar of gold beneath his floorboards, feeling less like salvation and more like a heavy target. He had his temporary victory. Debt was dead, and his land was secure. But in achieving it, he had sown the seeds of severe conflict. Croft's simmering resentment and Senator Preston's potent political enmity.
The gold had promised independence, but it had delivered him right back into the great American divide, forcing him to choose a side in a conflict far larger than his own survival. The summer of 1849 was a season of oppressive heat and rising paranoia. Elias and Abigail watched their fragile prosperity, their secured land and banked gold, begin to deteriorate under the crushing weight of the incoming tide. The gold boom had introduced a major external threat, not just the rush of people, but the collapse of civil order and the rise of organized crime. Elias realized that his initial dream, to secure a small piece of land and live freely, was flawed. In California, freedom was a commodity constantly under siege. The constant fear eroded their peace faster than any drought. The unraveling began with their dependence on the external, volatile market. Abigail, who managed the family's finances, discovered that the price of basic supplies had skyrocketed. Flour, which cost $5 a barrel 6 months prior, now cost $50. The gold in their jar, while plentiful, was losing its purchasing power against the dizzying inflation. The wealth was real, but its value was dissolving as the territory plunged into speculative frenzy. The threat soon manifested physically. Silas Croft, humiliated earlier, had joined a powerful group locally known as the Regulators, a vigilante squad ostensibly formed to police the lawless mines, but primarily used to seize rich, established claims. Croft became their muscle. One blistering August afternoon, the Regulators rode onto the Thorne property. They carried no legal papers, only rifles and the conviction of brute force. Their leader, a scarred veteran named Captain Vance, dismounted. "Thorne," Vance announced, his voice carrying an air of twisted authority. "Your claim is being reassessed by the local council. You've held too much prime water for too long. We're designating this stream public property. You can keep the field, but the water wheel goes, and the gold is ours to regulate." This was more than a land dispute. It was a fundamental attack on their right to property, the very bedrock of the American dream Elias had crossed the continent for. Elias knew that if he yielded the stream, the farm would die, and their survival would become impossible. Abigail stepped forward, her face pale but her demeanor resolute. "There is no local council, Captain Vance. This is theft. We hold a notarized deed signed under American authority. You are breaking the law." Vance smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "The only law here is the one we write, and we write it in lead." Elias stood ready for the fight, rifle in hand. The moment of confrontation was absolute. They were outnumbered and facing organized violence, a historical crisis born out of the legal vacuum in the newly conquered territory. Just as the standoff was about to erupt, a loud, urgent commotion saved them. A messenger arrived, riding hard from the fort, shouting a new, far greater calamity: cholera. The epidemic, sweeping across the trail all year, had finally reached the packed, unsanitary mining camps. The Regulators, afraid of disease more than law, broke formation. Vance gave Elias a parting, deadly glare. "This isn't finished, Thorne. We'll be back when the sickness passes."
The threat retreated, but the true unraveling thread was a profound, painful realization that followed. The dream was unattainable for all. Elias and Abigail spent the next weeks tending to the sick. They used their saved gold to buy the few available medicines, quinine and herbs, and dedicated their home as an infirmary for the poorest, hardest-hit migrants. It was during this time that Elias encountered one of the many Chinese laborers, a man named Jian, who had been ruthlessly exploited by his mining company. Jian was desperately ill, and Abigail nursed him back from the brink of death. As he recovered, he shared his story. His company, backed by powerful interests in San Francisco, had promised him a share of the gold, but had taken 90% and forced him to live in squalor. "We came here, Mr. Thorne," Jian whispered, his voice weak. "We came for the yellow metal, but they only see the color of our skin. They want the work, not the freedom. This was the final, devastating realization. Elias's initial dream of personal freedom and fortune was built upon a system that actively excluded and crushed others. The great American engine of manifest destiny was not benevolent. It was a brutal, extractive machine. His own success was, in part, a statistical fluke. He had arrived just early enough, and his skin color afforded him a legal defense the Chinese, the Mexicans, and the poor white miners did not have. The ultimate betrayal was not by Croft or Vance. It was the betrayal of the promise of the West itself. The gold that had saved their debt-ridden farm was simultaneously poisoning the land and the society around them. Elias looked at the jar of gold, their salvation. He knew he could sell everything, pay off his father's debts 10 times over, and live safely in the East. But he could not leave Jian or the other victims of the lawless system behind. He made a terrible, transformative choice. He used a portion of his gold not for personal gain, but to hire 3 reliable, honest men who had also survived the trail. He began to build a small armed militia, a true vigilante force dedicated to real law, to protect the infirmary and the defenseless miners. The prosperity was gone, sacrificed for a larger purpose. Elias Thorne was no longer a gold prospector or a farmer. The threads of his simple dream had unraveled, forcing him to become a reluctant architect of justice in a land defined by chaos. The cold, unforgiving wind of the approaching winter was nothing compared to the chill of the moral climate in California. Elias, abandoning his gold panning and most of his farming to focus on the immediate humanitarian crisis, had taken on an unofficial, dangerous role. With his sister Abigail's support, he had created a small armed enforcement group, a counter-vigilance unit known simply as the Protectors. Elias carried a heavy, crude iron star he had forged himself, his self-made badge. It was an emblem of the flawed authority he wielded in a land where legitimate law was absent. This was his central moral dilemma, to enforce justice in the absence of law. The true test of his values arrived not over land or gold, but over the great conflict that was tearing the nation apart: slavery and the chain. Senator Preston and his associates, seeing the wealth pouring out of the ground, had begun importing enslaved people, mostly young men from Missouri and Arkansas, renting them out as miners. This practice, technically illegal under the existing military rule, but functionally ignored, introduced a profound moral horror to the goldfields. One blustery morning, the Protectors, led by Elias, were called to a brutal scene. A young man, a runaway named Samuel, who had been enslaved by one of Preston's associates, had been recaptured near the Thorne property. His owner, a cruel man named Mr. Finch, no relation to the sympathetic traveler from the trail, intended to make a public example of him. Finch had tied Samuel to an old oak tree and was preparing to administer a brutal lashing. A small, horrified crowd had gathered, mostly powerless to intervene. Elias, wearing his iron badge, confronted Finch. "The use of the whip is not permitted in this territory, Finch. Slavery is not settled here." Finch, emboldened by the lack of legitimate authority, laughed. "This ain't your business, Thorne. He's my property, my chain. You're nothing but a dirt farmer playing sheriff. Move, or you'll feel the crack of the whip yourself." This was the defining clash of Elias's life. He stood between the promise of American freedom, embodied in his own hard-won prosperity, and the reality of the American chain, represented by Samuel. His values, his mother's quiet humanitarianism, his sister's fierce belief in written law, and his own painful memory of economic bondage were being tested in a singular, terrifying moment. The conflict was complicated by a simultaneous moral crisis: indigenous rights.
A small band of Miwok people, whose ancestral fishing ground lay near the stream Elias was now protecting, were being violently displaced by the influx of miners. They were starving, pushed off their land, and barred from the rivers by armed white prospectors. Abigail, recognizing the deep injustice, had begun secretly leaving food near their old encampment. She faced a difficult question. Was their right to their land, purchased legally with gold, more valid than the Miwok's ancient claim? One of Elias's protectors, a good man named Thomas, challenged him. "We can't fight everyone, Elias. If we protect the runaway slave, the Southerners will hang us. If we protect the Miwok, the miners will burn our farm. We must choose our battles." But Elias couldn't choose. The weight of the badge demanded he defend all victims of tyranny. He understood that the Miwok were suffering the same fate as the enslaved, their personhood and their property ignored in the mad dash for resources. Elias took his small band not to confront Finch directly, but to secure Samuel's release through legal maneuvering. He found the traveling circuit judge Abigail had used before and presented the case. Finch was violating the military governor's decree against the introduction of new enslaved people into the territory. He used his gold to post a substantial bond, forcing Samuel's release into the protector's custody, pending a formal hearing. The cost was immense. Finch and Preston publicly declared Elias an enemy of the established order, a traitor to Southern values, and a revolutionary. That same week, Elias addressed the desperate Miwok band, giving them 2 wagon loads of supplies and offering them safe passage and protection if they agreed to settle on a small piece of his land, away from the aggressive mining camps. He was not giving them their land back, but he was offering a temporary protected sanctuary. Abigail challenged him. "You've spent all our hard-won gold. You've made enemies of every powerful man in the territory. We are safe nowhere now." Elias looked down at the iron star in his hand. It felt cold and incredibly heavy. "The prosperity we built, Abby, was fragile. It meant nothing if we stood silent while men were whipped and families were murdered. We crossed the continent not just for gold, but for the principle of freedom. If that principle doesn't apply to Samuel and to the Miwok, then it never applied to us. We have traded the weight of debt for the weight of the badge."
He had chosen law over personal safety, humanity over wealth, and the chain of moral responsibility over the illusory freedom of the gold. His decision finalized his status not as a pioneer, but as a central, polarizing figure in the unfolding crisis of California. The tension had stretched thin for weeks, brittle as dry kindling. Elias's commitment to justice, protecting Samuel, the runaway, and offering sanctuary to the displaced Miwok, was not seen as civic duty, but as a declaration of war. The powerful Southern Bloc, led by Senator Preston, and the local crime syndicates, commanded by Captain Vance and Silas Croft, required a public example to reassert their dominance. The storm broke on a bitterly cold night in December 1849, the air thick with the promise of snow. It was not a grand battle, but a calculated, brutal act of terrorism designed to destroy Elias's moral authority and seize his land. The target was the Thorne farm and the small, vital enclave of people Elias was protecting. The initial alarm was the smell of smoke. The regulators, led by Croft and Vance, attacked under the cover of darkness. They did not aim for the house, but for the economic heart of the farm, the barn, filled with the last of the winter feed and the precious tools that represented their hard-won stability. Elias and Abigail were ready. They had anticipated a confrontation, arming their small group of protectors, Thomas, Gian, and 3 other trusted men with rifles and determination. Their defense was simple: protect the central house where the Miwok families and Samuel were sheltered. The fighting was chaotic and terrifyingly personal.
Croft's men were ruthless, firing indiscriminately, their shouts echoing the political mandate of their leaders. "Free State scum! This land is ours!" Elias and his men fought fiercely from behind the cover of the stone wellhead. Elias was driven not by anger, but by a chilling, resolute clarity. He knew that the man setting the fire, the one directing the attack, was Silas Croft, whose resentment over the land dispute had festered into murderous intent. Elias managed to pin down the attackers with concentrated fire. He saw Vance, the vigilante leader, emerge from the shadows, attempting to flank the house. Vance wasn't after the gold, he was after the badge, Elias's authority. It was during the peak of the fighting that the irreversible change occurred, a moment of profound personal tragedy that shattered the illusion of Elias's control. Abigail, recognizing that the barn fire would draw all their attention, had crept out the back of the house to reach the water cistern. She was not carrying a weapon, but the old, sturdy sewing needle in her pocket, a painful reminder of the domestic peace they were losing. She intended to douse the flames before they reached the main building. As she struggled with the heavy bucket, a figure lunged from the darkness. Senator Preston's aide, a petty, venomous man named Miller, whom Elias had humiliated in the political confrontations months prior. Miller didn't have a rifle, he had a torch. He wasn't aiming for the house, he was aiming for her. Abigail let out a single sharp cry, a sound that cut through the noise of battle and pierced Elias's heart. He turned instantly, seeing Miller raise the torch high. Elias fired his Hawken rifle, the sound deafening. The shot found its mark, and Miller collapsed, his torch falling harmlessly into the mud. But the damage was already done. In the brief, agonizing moment Elias had turned his back to save his sister, Vance, seizing the opportunity, rushed the wellhead. He tackled Thomas, Elias's second-in-command, and shot him at point-blank range. Thomas, the loyal protector, was killed. Elias watched his friend fall, the price of his moral stand paid in blood. The realization was instant and devastating. The iron badge was not a shield, it was a magnet for death. His attempts to bring justice had brought only destruction to those he loved. Rage, cold and absolute, replaced fear. Elias arose, abandoning the defensive position. He charged Croft and Vance, fighting not with tactics, but with the desperate strength of a man who has lost everything but his purpose. The fight was brief. Elias wounded Vance and finally confronted Croft near the burning barn. "You wanted the land, Croft? You wanted the freedom?" Elias shouted, wrestling the larger man to the ground. "You stole it all!" Croft yelled back, struggling to bring his knife to bear. Elias ended the confrontation with brutal efficiency, leaving Croft beaten and broken, but alive, a deliberate choice to deliver justice, not murder. By the time the remaining regulators fled, driven off by the returning Miwok men who had rushed to their aid, the Thorne farm was a smoking wreck. The barn was gone, the precious feed destroyed, and the core of the protectors, Thomas, was dead. The rising sun revealed the extent of the tragedy, the bodies of 3 attackers, the smoldering ruins of their enterprise, and the profound, heavy silence of loss. Elias stood beside Abigail, who was cradling Thomas's head in her lap. The gold they had saved, the farm they had built, all were gone or irrevocably damaged. But the true loss was Thomas. Elias looked at Samuel, the runaway, and the Miwok families, huddled near the main house, safe but terrified. He had failed to protect his friend, but he had protected the powerless. The storm had forced an irreversible change in Elias Thorne. He was no longer fighting for the Virginia farm or for his own freedom. The weight of Thomas's death, the political ruthlessness of Preston's organization, and the destruction of his home had solidified his final, defining commitment. He was no longer simply reacting to the injustice of the West.
He was now an active, hardened participant in the war for its soul. He had traded prosperity for purpose. The final legacy of California would not be gold, it would be the shape of its law, and Elias would dedicate his remaining life to ensuring that the law did not favor men like Preston and Vance. The days following the attack were characterized by a profound, exhausted quietude. The scent of burnt timber and wet earth hung heavy over the Thorne property, a perpetual reminder of the night the storm broke. Elias and Abigail moved through the ruins of their farm in a somber, silent partnership, performing the grim duties of the aftermath. Their first duty was to Thomas. They buried him beneath the old oak tree that marked the original boundary of their claim, a man who died defending a moral line far more important than any property line. Jian, the Chinese laborer, carved a simple cross from a piece of salvaged wood. Samuel, the runaway, wept openly, recognizing that his freedom had been purchased by Thomas's life. In the midst of this sorrow, the echoes from the ashes began to define the new status quo. The physical loss was immense. The barn, half their winter stores, and the intricate water wheel, the symbol of their agricultural stability, were all destroyed. Economically, they were reduced almost to the same position they held upon arriving in California, their fragile prosperity annihilated by violence.
However, the political and spiritual landscape had shifted entirely in their favor. The attack, intended to crush Elias's defiance, instead galvanized the nascent Free State and anti-vigilante factions. The brutal murder of Thomas, an honest, respected man, was too raw and shocking to be ignored. Miners and small farmers, those who had felt the sharp end of Vance's regulators or Preston's political power, began arriving at the Thorne homestead. They brought lumber, food, and most importantly, their loyalty. The attack had inadvertently created the community Elias had been unable to forge in the isolation of his success. Abigail oversaw the immediate rebuilding. She directed the new helpers, focusing their collective anger into constructive labor. The rebuilding was not just of the barn, it was of their mission. They used the salvaged iron from the burned wheel not to repair the farm, but to reinforce the walls of the main house, turning it into a fortress, a beacon of resistance. Elias, still wearing the weight of Thomas's death, spent hours sitting by the ashes, reflecting on the cost of the struggle. He realized that the greatest cost was the death of his original, narrow dream. He had come west to escape the great divisions of the East. Instead, he had been forced to fight them on a smaller, more lethal scale. "We failed, Elias," admitted Abigail one evening, her voice hoarse from directing labor. "We failed to keep Thomas safe. We failed to keep the peace." Elias shook his head, looking out at the glow of 100 small fires from the neighboring farms, fires set in solidarity, not malice. "No, Abby, we failed to stay small. We failed to stay neutral, but we didn't fail the purpose. The purpose was to hold the line, and we did. The price of that line was Thomas. We accept the cost, and we make sure his sacrifice was worth more than gold." The political new status quo was quickly established. The public outcry over Thomas's murder led the few remaining federal agents to finally act. Vance and Croft, having overplayed their hand, were now fugitives. Senator Preston, his reputation tainted by his association with the Terrorist Act, saw his political influence severely curtailed. Elias was no longer merely a dirt farmer playing sheriff. He was an acknowledged, albeit unofficial, leader of the Free Soil faction. The local judge, spurred by Abigail's relentless appeals, appointed Elias as the area's first provisional marshal. The crude iron star Elias had forged was replaced by a legitimate silver badge, the formal recognition of his authority.
This formal authority brought a chilling clarity. The badge meant law, but it also meant final, irreversible action. Elias's first official act was to sign the warrant for the arrest of Vance and Croft. Elias carried the weight of his experience as a physical burden. He had started the journey with the naive belief that wealth could buy freedom. He ended it knowing that freedom could only be bought with struggle and sacrifice. The gold was gone, but the cost of the struggle had paid for a far more enduring treasure, the respect of a community and the moral conviction of his cause. His perspective on his initial dream, the fallow ground of Virginia, was forever altered. He realized that the true fallow ground had not been the acres he left behind, but the moral landscape of the West itself. It was an empty space waiting for a seed, and the choices he had made, the violence he had faced, had sown the seeds of law and justice into that barren earth. His personal decision was now bound irrevocably to the region's historical destiny. He would not leave California. He could not with Thomas's grave on his land and Samuel's future in his hands. Abigail, too, had transformed. She continued to manage the rebuilding, turning the damaged homestead into a functional headquarters for the marshal's operations. She was the anchor, the strategist, and the keeper of the accounts, no longer just a hopeful girl with a book, but a foundational figure in the creation of California's civil society. Their path was clear. They would ensure that California, upon its admission to the Union, now pending, would enter as a free state, upholding the principle that gold belonged to the hands that dug it, not the hands that held the chains. The ashes of their farm were the foundation of their new purpose. The year 1850 marked the true resolution of Elias Thorne's saga. California was admitted to the Union not as a slave state, as Senator Preston had aggressively campaigned, but as a free state. This decision, forged in the crucible of gold and violence, was a triumph of the common settlers, the miners, the farmers, and the honest laborers over the powerful, expansionist Southern political machine. Elias and Abigail's struggle had a subtle but profound, lasting historical impact. Their defiance, culminating in the tragedy of Thomas's death, had provided the undeniable moral catalyst that solidified the anti-slavery movement within the territory. They were not national heroes, but local architects of freedom. Elias, now officially Marshal Thorne, remained burdened by his badge, but no longer by debt. He never returned to the Shenandoah Valley. His life was permanently fixed on the western frontier, defined by the law he worked tirelessly to uphold. He oversaw the arrests and subsequent trials of Captain Vance and Silas Croft. The trials were bitter and politically charged, but Elias and Abigail, using the meticulous documentation Abigail had maintained, ensured the convictions stuck. The justice was slow, but it was legitimate, proving that the law could exist even in the gold fields. Elias never resumed full-time mining. The gold now represented sacrifice, not fortune. His small landholding, rebuilt and secured, was managed by Gian and Samuel, who became his trusted deputies and partners. The Miwok families, under Elias's protection, secured a small, quiet tract of land away from the aggressive mines, maintaining a delicate, hard-won peace. Abigail Thorne found her ultimate purpose not as a pioneer wife, but as a driving force for civil society. She used her intelligence and relentless energy to help found the county's first permanent schoolhouse and was instrumental in establishing California's complex system of land and water rights, rules designed explicitly to prevent the kind of predatory claim jumping and lawlessness that had nearly ruined them. Her contribution was the quiet, necessary infrastructure of civilization. One afternoon, standing in the new, simple courthouse that Abigail had helped fund, Elias looked at her, his face permanently etched by sun and hardship. "We did it, Abby. We paid the tost. We are free." Abigail smiled, a rare, full smile that reflected the vast open sky above them. "We are free, Elias, but freedom is not land, it is the work." The legacy of the Thorne name was not riches, but principle. The original jar of gold dust was eventually sent back to the Shenandoah Valley. Elias's father, Old Man Thorne, used it not merely to pay off the debt, but to buy neighboring land and establish a small, sustainable farm, the very stability Elias had sought. He had achieved his original goal, but through a long, bloody loop that transformed him utterly. He had sent the gold, but he could not send the peace. Elias's own final fate was tied to the open road of America's future. In 1853, after establishing a functional law structure in his county, Elias felt the familiar, restless call of the frontier. California was settling. The fight had changed from a chaotic scramble for survival to the tedious work of governance. He recognized that his true purpose lay where the law was still a concept, not a reality.
He resigned his marshal position, handing the badge over to Samuel, a freedman now vested with the authority of the law, a poetic and powerful statement about the West's potential. Abigail chose to stay. Her fight was now in the schoolhouse and the magistrate's office, the building blocks of society. They parted not in sorrow, but with shared understanding. They had fulfilled their contract to secure freedom for their family and to pay the cost of their choices. Elias Thorne took a single ox, a light wagon, his Hawken rifle, and his simple iron badge, now a personal keepsake. He did not go east. He did not go home. He turned his gaze north, toward the new territories being carved out of the wilderness, places like Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, where the gold rush was just beginning, and the weight of the badge was still desperately needed to prevent the lawlessness he had fought so hard to defeat. He was an American archetype, the reluctant hero, forever bound to the frontier, chasing not gold, but the persistent, elusive ideal of order and justice. The story of Elias Thorne concludes with him driving his single ox into the morning mist, a man who had left the certainty of the fallow ground to face the storm, emerging not wealthy, but whole. His journey was a microcosm of America's own struggle, a relentless, imperfect process of sacrificing initial gain for lasting principle, always looking forward toward the endless open road of its own becoming.